One, two.
Person's voice.
Here we go. The regular announcements. Only I'm going to say everybody's name correctly today. This is something new. So, registration for the last 2 sessions is open now. Chris French. Oh, he's French. Not French Chris, Chris French. Yeah. He's going to speak on April 24th and George Drake on May 1st. So, at break time, if you haven't registered, please do that. And that's the end. 2 more after today. And then, as usual, if you're using T-coils, you can turn that on now. Have you turned your phone off or put it on vibrate? If so, if not, please do. And if we end up doing question and answer, which we may or may not, be sure and speak right into the mic and tell us your name. I am delighted to introduce today Karen Edwards, who is the Associate Dean for International Student Affairs at the college. Karen is an Iowan. She received her master's from the University of Iowa in International Education and Higher Ed Administration. She's also an artist, and you may have seen her various works. She has a tree in her front yard that is now a mosaic tree, which is fabulous. And a new piece, I think, in the stew. Yeah, great. She says she does that late at night when she can't sleep. Good tip, I'm going to try it. Karen has traveled to over 30 countries in the world, and her husband as well travels internationally and brings the students to Grinnell so that Karen can be of assistance to them when they get here. So we're delighted to have you here today, Karen.
I think this is my first time doing anything with one of these. I feel like Madonna, but I promise I won't sing. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, good. I actually, I'm a practitioner, not a professor, so I don't typically stand up in front of an audience. If I present is a little bit nervous, it's because this is a little new format for me. But I was really happy to be able to be a part of this, and I feel like the work of international student advising has changed so much in the span of my career, and I think it's important for me to have the opportunity to talk about that in the public sphere, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what this work is all about. So I welcome the opportunity to talk to you. I was thinking in the introduction, the idea that a small town girl from Iowa works with international education in a small town in Iowa is sort of unique and interesting and maybe unexpected. So I thought it might be helpful to give 3 starter points that I look back on as to what set me off on this path. When I graduated from high school, I had visited 4 states in the U.S. But I can trace back and remember very vividly a 2nd grade teacher, Mrs. Bombars, whose daughter was in the Peace Corps in Thailand. And I remember, as if it were yesterday, the vibrancy with which I learned about this exotic place very far away. And I came home, and my mom remembers that I came home and said, someday I'm going to Thailand. And I think that little piece motivates my work often. It motivates my thought of how global education, international education, and travel can impact a person's worldview at a very young age. For us, when some of our students face incidents of bias or incidents of naivete about their home country, it reinforces the idea that helping them get into local classrooms, local schoolrooms, can help make the world a smaller place and a more accessible place. So I think that really motivated me years ago. I had a really amazing undergraduate advisor at Luther College up in Decorah. And when I was unsettled in what I wanted to do, he encouraged me to study abroad in Copenhagen. That was a really hard experience for me. I was miserable much of the time, and it changed my life. So it was a hard situation that was able to, I think, transition and help me think about the world in a different context. And the third opportunity that fell my way was right before I went to graduate school. I had the opportunity to work in Malaysia at the American Commission for Educational Exchange in Kuala Lumpur. And that's where I sort of connected the idea between US students going abroad as study abroad students with the idea that we are also a destination for students in the United States. And so when I went to graduate school, I was able to kind of shape and mold the confluence of the outgoing journey and the ingoing journey and sort of set the stage for my career. I think of working in Iowa not as working in the middle of nowhere, but as working in the middle of everywhere. And our students really do have access to the world in multiple ways. So if we can shift that narrative to a more positive engagement, I think it really does us a better service in terms of what Grinnell is looking to do. The Office of International Student Affairs at the college sits within the Division of Student Affairs, and we will soon be co-located in the Institute for Global Engagement, which is in the new building, the HSSC. So our function will be connected to the concept of incoming, outgoing, not just students, but also scholars and educators. We do regulatory work to support short-term faculty that come in and do coursework and bring new perspectives to our curriculum. But our office really focuses on four main things: immigration, student advising and support. We counted close to 2,700 individual appointments between the three of us last year. Programming, which unfortunately has become a smaller portion of what we do. I think when I started in the field, the concept of cultural programming and dialogue was probably 75% of the work, and that over the years that has become, the regulatory burdens have become more like, the regulatory stuff is more 75–80% of the work, unfortunately. I think the fourth thing that has really shifted for our field is that our office has shifted from being a direct support for international students to thinking about institutional infrastructure and the ways that the college as a whole becomes a welcoming place, and the community as a whole becomes a welcoming place. So a short little pretest is to turn to the person next to you and try to name two things that you think an institution like Grinnell or an office like mine is doing to support international students. Two things. I'm not going to collect responses, but I want you to self-reflect a little as I talk through the points that I'm going to make. And maybe at the end we'll have time to think about what your perception of the work we do, how that might shift as you hear kind of what we're focusing on now. I'll start with a few terms. Oops, that was the slide for what you just did. The vocabulary in the field has shifted. So you might be used to using the concept of talking to about international students as foreign students. The word foreign has a slightly negative connotation. It implies difference and distance. And so we have shifted the vocabulary. So forgive me if you reference our students as foreign students. I will be very likely to correct you and help you shift that language. Another vocabulary word is that international students are either typically degree-seeking students or they're exchange students. An exchange student comes here for a semester or a year and then they return to their home university. High school exchange students would also be using that vocabulary. Right now at Grinnell, all of our international students are degree-seeking international students. And there's no, neither is a better, or they're different scenarios, and so they need different kinds of things. And so I think that's a vocabulary word that's kind of helpful to be able to wrap your head around. It's also true that our international students at the college are non-immigrants. That means that when they got their visa status to come and join us, they had to declare non-immigrant intent to the US government. We think about immigration reform, it's a huge topic in the news right now, but to be able to distinguish the difference between supporting immigrant communities and supporting non-immigrant communities, it changes the vocabulary and the work in very specific ways that we'll talk about too. Grinnell, of course, also enrolls immigrant students, and the gallery of flags on the first floor of the JRC represents all Grinnell students including students that maintain a foreign citizenship even though they are an immigrant or permanent resident. So the number of flags in the gallery is larger than the countries represented by our international students. Fourth topic, or vocabulary word, is the word of global nomad. We also refer to these students as third culture kids. Global nomad is a student, or is a young person who has lived or grown up during their developmental years in a country that is not their passport country. So at Grinnell, we have a number of students that are not, by government definition, international students, but they have spent much of their life, if not most. Maybe a parent was a diplomat, maybe they were working with ExxonMobil, maybe they were an educator in the international circuit. There's all sorts of varieties. But our office invites global nomad and third culture kids to participate in much of the programming we do because from a cultural perspective, they're very new to this environment. But when I talk about the numbers of international students at the college, it doesn't include global nomads. That's a different population. The last three terms I just will touch on now. I do have a section where we'll talk more about regulations, if you'll let me. F1, but you might hear me spatter these words because it's just words we use all the time. But F1 students, that's the visa that our international students who are degree-seeking students use to come to the U.S. So we often reference international students or F1 students as an interchangeable title. SEVIS is the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, and that's the federal database that came into place after 9/11, through which institutions and the government communicate back and forth electronically about a whole variety of things related to those students, the student stay. So we talk a lot about SEVIS compliance, and I don't know if you noticed on my first slide when it had my title, Associate Dean, Director of International Student Affairs, PDSO. I have the certification, the title called a Principal Designated School Official. We have 3 PDSOs at the college in my office, and we have the authority and ability to manage and use the government database system to facilitate that communication back and forth. We are also responsible officers, which is a different designation that we have. So on my business card, it actually has both acronyms because that is the designation to support scholars and exchange visitors that come in to teach our short courses. So this graph shows context of international enrollment at Grinnell over the years. It's sort of pretty obvious. What you're seeing here is significant growth. From 7.6% of the student body in 1998, we're right now at about 20% of our student body in 2018. That we admit we had this year about 2,700 international applicants to the college. We admitted 9%. And typically have a first-year cohort of about 90 students that come in. It means that they're 20% of our student body. It means they're 1 in 5. That's very high on a comparative sense. Forbes lists Grinnell in the top 50 schools in terms of international enrollment. And that shift has had a direct impact on our office and on the institution at large. And I think it has driven this concept of thinking about campus-wide, how we support the cohort. This shows you the diversity of the pool of our international enrollment of 302 students from 45 countries. About a third in the top cohort come from China. About a third, a little larger than a third here, come from large cohorts, places where there's closer to 20 to 40 students from those countries. India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Pakistan. And then we have a new term that we use on campus. We refer to our rare birds, and those are our students that come from cohorts with 4 or fewer fellow nationals on campus. So for example, there might be 1 student from Ethiopia, or 2 from Romania, or Ethiopia, so you get the idea. So smaller cohorts. And if you can think about what it would be like as a student, whether you're from one of those three cohorts really changes your onboarding and your social life, right? Because if you're from a place that has over 100 students like China does, that community, that sense of peer group is really different than it is if you're alone from your country. So we think statistically, like if the college is doing a survey about the international student voice, there's no singular voice in this community, so, but you can kind of imagine that if you're one of those three cohorts, your voice might have more connection to each other. We actually do events for rare birds where we bring them together socially, and it's really healthy. It's so good for them to know each other. Beyond nationality, of course, the international student diversity is also about what kind of high school they attended. So you could have two students from China. One attended an international baccalaureate program, one attended a rural local institution. They have a really different experience as they transition. So we also have to remember that diversity is not just about nationality. It might be about your language experience, it's about your faith tradition, that's where our Center for Religion, Spirituality, and Social Justice gets connected, or your dietary needs, and socioeconomic status. And I'll talk in a bit about the diversity of financial scenarios and socioeconomic backgrounds from our international students. We have students within that cohort who will go home regularly on breaks and will not work on campus. And we have students from within that cohort who are on full scholarship and have it's very likely they won't go home all 4 years, and they will work up to 20 hours a week on campus. So that diversity also is very interesting. When we say 1 in 5 Grinnellians, that means that this cohort is 1 in 5 of the students that you see walking up and down the campus is transitioning to the U.S. academic environment, transitioning and learning about navigating systems like healthcare and taxes and tornadoes, right? And adjusting to life in English, and all of them are impacted by their immigration status. So it really does touch every functional area of campus. You might be familiar with the concept of universal design, which was defined in the Disability Act of 2005. I kind of lean on this when I think about how we support international students, because universal design says the design of an environment so that it may be accessed and understood by all, regardless of ability or other factors. And I think if we apply that in the international student context, we could say that all of Grinnell's systems, teaching and advising tools, the way we do our business needs to think about the international student cohort when 1 in 5 of those students is coming from outside the U.S. I think we can also look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This idea that if you want a student to thrive, you have to meet their basic needs, and then you need to think about how you create friendship and belonging, and you do those things first so that they can thrive. And I think that really does apply in the international student context as well. And both of those really lean on the infrastructure. I'm going to pause a second because I feel like I'm going fast. When I think about infrastructure, I decided, I kind of pulled this out, I talked to some folks about it. I really think infrastructure boils down to 4 different areas. Budgetary issues, which I don't know if that's the right word, but budgetary, financial, infrastructure, staffing, logistical issues, cultural issues, and regulatory issues. And those 4 boxes really touch the academic experience, the residential experience, and the business practices of the school. So I'm going to give you a couple examples in each of these 4 categories. I'll start with budget and infrastructure, or budget and operations. At the college, we have 2.5 people who are dedicated positions for international recruiting. John Edwards, Melinda Drees, and Grace Lloyd. And then other staff who travel. We have a really sizable travel budget, and that's not just about directly recruiting, but it's about networking and about yield activities. Our office, my office, is 3 full-time people, Brenda Strong, who many of you might know, is in her 22nd year at the college. She's incredibly brilliant, especially in the regulatory areas, and I lean on her heavily in that regard. Molly Olstead is a young new professional in our area, and she helps us a lot with our programming. She just joined us in August. But we also hire 12 student mentors, and they become really, really key when we think about building an infrastructure. The other office that's regarding staffing and budget is that my office has good funding for professional development. So I feel really privileged to be at a place where it is expected that I'm engaged professionally in attending training and going to national and regional conferences. And more important recently is that we've been given permission to have an immigration attorney on retainer. And we work regularly with an immigration attorney that has helped us do deep dives of all our policy issues, and that becomes really, really important. Financial aid, of course, is also part of the budgetary infrastructure. Grinnell spends $7 million a year on grant assistance to international students. We also have an in-house loan program. So international students, through most loan avenues, like through most banks or other places, would have to have a U.S. cosigner in order to access an educational loan. But Grinnell has an in-house program. So international students have access to small loans to help support their education, even if they don't have a U.S. cosigner. Our financial aid office also wraps health insurance and the cost of health insurance into the needs assessment for international students. When I highlight some of these, I highlight them because they're unique, they're special. This is not true on many, many college campuses across the country. And I think even our students often don't recognize how unique this actually is. But the fact that we require health insurance, not all institutions do, but we require all students, including internationals, to have that. It becomes really, really important. But it's a little a new thing to navigate coming from outside the U.S. Many students are coming from places where the concept of health insurance is really unfamiliar. International students also have access to lots of opportunities at the college that are unique. For example, an international student who has financial aid at Grinnell can use that aid to study abroad. It goes with them if they study abroad. On many campuses, someone who's already abroad as an international student would not have the benefit of access to that kind of opportunity. We also supplement campus employment. So a student on many campuses, if my department hires a student who has federal work study, that's supplemented by government funds. So it actually would cost my department on many campuses less to hire a student with federal work study than it would to hire an international student. At Grinnell, that playing field has been even, and we supplement that fund. So my department can hire the best student for the job, and that benefits our international students because there's an even playing field there. A student emergency fund is also an important thing that's funded by donors, and if an international student has a challenge that requires engagement with family or travel, or the fact that they have access to this fund is also really valued. That doesn't mean we don't have students who encounter needs that we don't have the ability to meet. We absolutely do. But that infrastructure is in place. I'm going to go to number 2, logistics and business practices. I actually think these aren't quite as fun, but they're sort of interesting. So home is very far away, right? So that means going home is expensive, logistically challenging. So the infrastructure that we need on an international student-friendly campus is for our Res Life folks to understand that. And so we have a 24-hour arrival departure flexibility for people with an international flight. That seems pretty simple, but it isn't. It's really valuable and important to be an international student-friendly campus. We also are very lucky that our residential life folks allow students whose home is outside of the United States to stay on campus over winter break at no additional cost. And our student health center is open during that time. They do have to cook for themselves. The Center for Religion, Spirituality, and Social Justice runs a food pantry. Our dining hall offers grocery support. So there is a lot of infrastructure in place in that regard. Money transfers are costly, paying bills across international borders, all the bank fees and the wiring exchange rates, etc. So our bursar has a relationship with Flywire, which is a business that helps prevent the high cost of financial exchanges, and it makes it more efficient and less costly for money to be transferred. Mail is unpredictable and slow. So a small example of that is that every first-year student is asked to read a book. It's a common read. You've maybe heard about that program. The first year we did it, we tried to mail books all over the world, and most of the students either didn't get them or got them 2 days before they left from home, which was okay because they could read it on the long flight. But our Office of Intercultural Affairs really partnered with that and has made those books available through an electronic system. So I think the more and more we think about catching things like that, then we're creating an infrastructure to support the unique needs of students in this. I'm going to skip that one. Emergency contacts is also interesting. So we have some good infrastructure for emergency contacts. Now every student who lists their emergency contact is asked the language fluency of their family. So if I'm working with a scenario that needs emergency support from home, I have access to, it's called Language Line. It's an online translation service so that I can communicate with family through the help of a real-time translator in nearly any language I would ever need. And that is also, an infrastructure piece. Cultural transitions was my third box. I love this image. This is actually, I'm supposed to cite it, it's from a book called East Meets West by an artist named Young Liu. And it's actually, the blue is portraying Germany, and because the artist was a student in Germany at the time, and the red is portraying China. But I think it's a really good exhibit to think about when we talk about the cultural dynamic of power distance. Gert Hofstede coined 6 dimensions of cultural difference in his study years ago, and one of them is the concept of power distance. Many of our students come from systems where hierarchy is much more obvious in the educational environment. They're coming from teacher-driven classrooms instead of student-driven classrooms. They're coming from places where using resources has a much more hierarchical feel. And so when we think about infrastructure at the college to support that specific issue in terms of cultural differences, we do lots of different things. We invite faculty to do small group, circle round, informal discussions during our international pre-orientation program. That session, it's an hour, it seems pretty simple, but it sends a very clear message that faculty are partners in your learning here. They are not, it's not a hierarchical relationship in the same way that many of our students, they come from classrooms where you stand up and are formally addressed if you have a question, for example, or if you need to go to the restroom, you raise your hand. So that the adjustment in that academic environment is different. Our office also, our staff meet with every incoming international student in a one-on-one meeting where we actually talk specifically about some of the norms that we see in terms of transitions. That one-on-one meeting is also only an hour, but it sends a very clear message when we stop and have a conversation with an individual student that we are here to support their journey. But those mentors I talked about earlier, the upperclassmen peers, are probably the most important thing that we do. Having upperclassmen who know the system, who know the way around campus, and who can be a peer mentor to help students, to help demystify the power distance in terms of seeking resources is very, very important. Oops. What do I do there? Most of our students are from big cities. And they get here and it's a little bit intimidating to walk around and see how empty it is. It helps a little when all the rest of the students show up and then there's, the vibrancy of campus. But many are intimidated by small town Iowa, by the Midwest, by concerns about potential anti-foreigner sentiment or racial bias. And unfortunately, those are realities that they do face here. But we have infrastructure to help with some of that. We, as you know, have a host family program focused on the first-year students to try to introduce them to how cool our town is. And so they might be intimidated at first to meet a stranger, but it helps connect them across generations, and I know many of you have been involved in that program. We made these signs a few years ago. I've got a few extras left in here if anybody wants to take them. No matter where you are from, we're glad you're our neighbor. Again, not a huge thing, but really does send a message of welcome. And those things do matter when our students walk downtown and see that the local coffee shop has one of those signs in the windows. That does matter to them. We also do a downtown scavenger hunt during orientation to introduce the community. That's a great picture. I love that. And our students participate in the homecoming parade at the high school, talk about a cultural experience, right? We're doing a lot more with our cultural attaché program. Molly, our new advisor, has had nearly 20 international students into local elementary school classrooms this year. And actually high school too. The cricket was in a high school physical education class. Zhang was at a high school foods class, and Machiko is doing origami in an elementary school classroom here. My final slide about cultural adjustment is based on a recent conversation I had with Sakatan. There's a picture of him right there. And we were talking about identity, and he said that he feels like he has 3 primary identities. One is that he's Indian, one is that he's an international student, and one is that he's Grinnellian. And we talked about our goal and our hope that he sees them in this way, that he can focus on connecting with his national cohort, and that brings him into the larger community as an international student. But the most significant identity there is to be a Grinnellian, the largest identity there. And if we are thinking about infrastructure at the college, that would be our goal, that our students can maintain their identity, be who they are, but be very engaged campus-wide. And I think we have multiple collaborators on campus that are thinking about identity and are thinking about global citizenship. Our intercultural affairs office supports all these different student organizations that support cultural focus. But international students should also be on the stage, in the theater department, and in the music, and on the athletic fields. And so I think the more we can think about not just their identity as an Indian student or an international student, but as a Grinnellian, that opens up a whole different avenue for them. How am I doing? Okay, we're in a bad spot to have 5 minutes left. Well, let me keep going, because then maybe we'll have time for, let's stop right now and do our break. And then we'll talk about immigration. I was going to talk about immigration. Stuck it out. I don't know if you had a chance to look at the flow chart, the colorful, the orange box and the green box and the blue, the different boxes. I think I call it Grinnellians before, during, and after. I also understand that I didn't spell out my acronyms on there. So OISA is Office of International Student Affairs, and IPOP is the International Pre-Orientation Program. But this flow chart is a tool that it's actually based on a tool online, and the URL is listed there, but that is done by the USCIS, the government basically, that shows, it's called there the life cycle of an F1 student. And so I took that tool and adapted it to Grinnellify it a little bit to give you the flow. So I feel like when we talk about regulatory infrastructure and we look at this chart together, what it does, we mentioned Maslow, but what it does to Maslow's hierarchy of needs is it really says as an institution that this infrastructure of supporting the immigration needs of students is a really important base for Maslow, right? So that if we don't have that infrastructure in place, then our students are worried about it all the time and managing it and dealing with it. So I want our students to be worried about belonging, or about safety and belonging and classwork, right? I don't want this burden to get in the way. And it does get in the way anyway, I feel like that's a really key visual to think about what we're doing. This little stamp is a stamp in their passport, the F1, it has their visa status, and I won't even explain what the DS is about. So I'm going to start that on that one-page flow chart, boxes 1, 2, 3, and 4 all happen before the student even arrives in our country. So that's how this flow chart is sort of set up. So those top 4 boxes are pre-arrival, the middle box is while they're a student, and that bottom box is after they've graduated. And our office is responsible for the work through that entire stage, up to 3 years after they graduate. So box 1 is about the application. So Grinnell is and schools who enroll international students are CVIS certified. There's a pretty lengthy review process. We renew that every year, but it basically gives us the authority and the permission to enroll international students. Within the ACM and GLCA institutions, our peer institutions in that cohort, there's only one school in that whole group who is not CVIS certified. My prediction is over the next few years, you're going to see lots of smaller residential liberal arts colleges who really get out of the business of international student enrollment because of the increased burdens and fees that are involved in this work and risk and liability. So when a student applies to Grinnell, and I'm putting this in the Grinnell context, but this regulatory path would be the same at most other institutions. They also complete a TOEFL exam, the test of English as a foreign language. They do the same admission testing and high school records and references. And international students then at Grinnell apply for financial aid as part of their application to the college. The cohort coming from outside of the United States are not admitted in a need-blind way as our domestic students are. So that's a really significant difference in that path. Box 2 is about securing the I-20. The I-20 is the immigration document. It's actually a paper document, but it has biographical, academic, and financial information about the student that we have entered into the government's database. And the database has a lot more information than you'd see on that paper document, but they have to have the paper document in order to go and pay their visa application, pay their online CVIS fee, the boxes give you a little detailed information about exactly what that is. But before they've even come here, they've paid multiple fees and got onto multiple systems to add information before they go to their visa interview. The number 3 here is the CVIS fee and the visa application. They make an appointment at a U.S. consulate that's located outside the United States. This would be slightly different if they've been a high school student and they're coming in an F1 status from another school in the U.S. They get about 2 minutes to interview. They all have to interview. They typically show their funding. They present the immigration document, their passport, and they are required to show and to articulate non-immigrant intent, that they don't intend to be in the U.S. long-term. Sometimes a consular officer might ask them where on earth Grinnell, Iowa is. Sometimes they might ask them why they're going to study, what they want to study. There's all sorts of random questions, and from us we give some tips on encountering that. Some, it's very easy and others it takes a longer time. Male students from some countries are required to go through background checks. It might take 2 or 3 months until they hear back, and others will hear back right away on the spot whether their visa was accepted or denied. Most of the students who are coming to Grinnell will get a 5-year entry visa. That means they can come and go as long as they are staying enrolled and we're signing their documents throughout those 5 years. Students from some countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, there are a lot of those students will come in with only 1-year visas. That doesn't mean they have to travel to renew, because they can stay inside the United States and maintain their status on an expired visa. It just means if they travel and exit, they will have to renew that visa. But we do a lot of programming and support to help individual students understand their needs, especially if they get involved in off-campus study or course-embedded travel where they're traveling internationally. Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm step 4, the arrival at the port of entry. So up until they enter the United States, they could still be denied entry, and so they are still presenting that information, their funding, their documents at the border. The minute they enter the border, it's registered into an electronic system that our office is notified that they entered. They arrive on campus, and we have a bunch of stuff we do right at the very beginning to help set the stage. So these are pictures, for example, of the entire first-year class last fall on their way to Des Moines to apply for their Social Security numbers. That is pretty much an all-day activity, and it's a really good 101 in American bureaucracy. On the other hand, they're coming from places and they know what bureaucracy is too. So it's maybe not that unique or different. They also have a ton of fun, and it's so interesting how something that feels to me so miserable ends up being a huge bonding experience for them. They bring frisbees, soccer balls, and they hang out on the lawn, and one by one they go in and do the business that they are there for. Because they're 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, we also spend a lot of time on best practice tips. So all of them receive a passport sleeve from us that has our contact information as an office. We have a trapper folder for them that is labeled to help them keep health information, social security information, tax information, bank information, and really walk through them with some appropriate adulting 101 skills to help them stay organized. While they're enrolled at Grinnell, here's a few examples of things they have to do. Of course, our office is responsible to maintain their data in the government system. Any changes that happen are required to be reported within 10 days. So the infrastructure on campus is that if a change happens in the registrar system, we receive electronic alerts and go into, it's called a real-time interactive system for each individual student. If they declare a major, if they are under-enrolled, if they change from Residence Hall A, Room B, to Residence Hall C, Room D, we literally have to notify the government if a student moves from Room A to B, even within the same residence hall. So we really depend on our data systems to help feed us that information. They have to be enrolled full-time, and there are limited exceptions for medical reasons and for a few other things, but they have to be very well documented. We also deal a lot with coming and going. So if a student takes a personal leave, gets suspended, has a personal emergency and needs to take a semester off, those kinds of things all require this whole thread of lines to start all over again. So, there's a lot involved in those kinds of pieces too. We actually depend on our students to adult and pay attention to expiration dates. We do not monitor that for them. But for example, if you have a passport that expires, that has an expiration date on it, you would typically trust that date. But international visitors have to have a passport that is valid for 6 months into the future. So we have to teach things like, this date is not the date you think it is. You need to come back and put that on your calendar. It also, typically, if they need to renew from within the US, they are going to have to go in person to Chicago. We work with a system, office there, a Trevisa service that helps and can sometimes represent our students in person. And other times the student has to actually go on their own. It depends on the scenario. They can work on-campus jobs up to 20 hours per week, and that has to be monitored. If they exceed that, it's a violation of their status. And then over breaks, they can work full-time, which is very helpful financially if they can do that. The nuances of off-campus work are very challenging. I won't drill into this very deeply, but I will say that if a student is doing an off-campus internship, whether it is paid or unpaid, it is required that they receive authorization to do so. And so we have systems in place working closely with our Careers, Life, and Services office to help students who get unpaid internships pass through the proper channels so that they can receive academic credit for that internship. The internship has to be directly related to their major area of study. And so as you can imagine, for some majors that would be quite simple, and for others it would be quite complicated. For example, is a marketing internship related to your major in anthropology? How many think it is? I think it is, but the government doesn't always think it is, right? And so we work very closely with students to help them think about and articulate how their major is directly related to their, how their internship is directly related to their major. That is a huge challenge for liberal arts colleges, and it's one that we partner with heavily with our immigration attorney and with our colleagues at other liberal arts colleges. I guess the other thing to mention is that this has become increasingly, compliance has become increasingly important. You may be heard about unlawful presence rules that changed, that made national news. Years ago, well, not years ago, a year ago, if a student fell out of status, made a mistake, did something wrong, you wouldn't actually be calculating days of unlawful presence immediately. It had to be ruled on by a judge. So if you did something like take an unpaid internship without having practical training and you were challenged about that and reviewed and it was determined that you violated your status by doing that, the days of unlawful presence now under the new law start counting as of when you did the thing, not as of when it was determined that it was a problem. So that's a really simple example of a really complicated law, but it means that everything we do in terms of helping prevent students from making mistakes is really important because because there's nothing we can do at the back end if they made the mistake. They are already out of status and in unlawful presence. I think the other piece that's sort of gray here is all the concepts that we do a lot with volunteering, we do a lot with community engagement. We have shifted, for example, if a student is enrolled in a class at the college that involves maybe computer science has a couple of these classes where they are involved in an off-campus venue and they're contributing actively to the workforce by creating a website, creating a project, doing something that adds value for the work site. That is perceived as practical training is necessary. So it isn't just the word employment gets confusing, it's also engagement and contribution to the work site. And so that's where we've added the flow chart. And basically it says, if you are working at a for-profit entity, you need authorization. If you're working at a non-profit entity and you will be paid, you need authorization. But if you're not paid, the next question is, would someone else be paid for that work? And if someone else would, you need authorization. And then the next question is, would this work otherwise be done by a paid employee? And they need authorization. And so this has become really burdensome and challenging as we navigate supporting students well. We have, I think, really solid tools to help students, but they also do need to read and need to dig it up and come to our information sessions. But we've put infrastructure, so for example, with the classes that need practical training authorization, our faculty have been really important partners because they're actually putting into the course syllabus. If you're an F1 student and you're taking this class, you need to visit the OYSA and process your practical training. And that's really important to us because it means that the students coming through that process will understand it and hear that message in multiple places and in multiple ways. Right now, we're just wrapped up tax season. For non-immigrant students, tax season is a really big deal. Well, it's a big deal for all of us. Who am I kidding? But the new tax code removed the personal exemption for non-resident taxpayers. And so up until last year, for example, an international student could automatically earn the personal exemption before they would become have tax obligations. That has gone away, so they are taxed now starting at $1. And so it's been a really big shift for them from feeling pretty sure that they're going to get most of that refunded and the tax withholding for non-residents is also higher. So we lease a software to help support that. Students are given free access to a code. They go into a software system. And our office does not give individual tax advice, but our office facilitates tax advice through this system that we purchased and help supporting them. One of the pieces there that's an important clarification is we're not just helping them support tax compliance because it's part of the tax law. We're also supporting compliance because as an F1 visitor in the United States, filing a tax return is required. So they have to file even if they didn't work on campus and have no taxable income. Or they will be violating their status. So these resources are really important. They're password protected, they're behind the wall, so we don't want to give immigration advice to students at other institutions. But they have lots of hot links and to help them navigate these processes. After they graduate from Grinnell, they really have 4 options. Obviously, depart the U.S. And return home or pursue studies in another country. Pursue graduate school in the United States. If they do that, our office releases their CVIS record through an electronic system to the new school. And there's some nuances there about exit and reentry in the country, etc. But that about 1/3 of our students will pursue a graduate study in the United States directly after they're with us. 1/3 or so, maybe a little higher, will pursue optional practical training, which is a 12-month work permit. Again, that work has to be directly related to their major field of study. There's an application fee and a 90-day adjudication process, and we support those applications. They actually applied, most of them in late January, early February, with the goal of working midsummer. It takes about 90 days to get that authorization through. They can do OPT regardless of major, but if they major in a STEM field, which is very defined, so at Grinnell, biology, biochem, physics, chemistry, computer science, what am I missing? Psychology and economics now. So very specific majors, if they major in those fields, that they can, after OPT is over, they can apply for something else called STEM OPT, which gives them 24 additional months to work in the United States through their STEM major, with a couple caveats. So when they're on OPT and STEM OPT, they're still on a student visa. They're still responsible to Grinnell College, and we are still responsible to report their address, their employment information through the system. If they travel and exit out of the country, we still have to sign their endorsement of their travel. It is considered training, not really employment in that regard, right? And then when they're on their STEM OPT, they have a 6-month training plan. Every 6 months, they have to submit to us a training plan that incorporates what they're learning on the job and how they're engaging in that workforce. After this, some will pursue an H-1B or other kinds of employment authorization in the U.S. and they would be off our CBIS roll at that point. But we have right now about 30-some alum who are on OPT and STEM OPT in the United States working, but on our CBIS roll. That's what I've got. So I'm trying to think. I got one question at the break about China. Somebody asked me if the percentage of students from China was unique to Grinnell, and it is not. We're about a third of our students come from China, and that would be true nationwide. It's actually, I think it's 32.5% of all international students in the US right now come from China. In my career, that's been a huge shift. When I started in this work, students from China didn't get visas. We didn't have any students from China at the College of Worcester in 1985. But that has shifted tremendously. I'm trying to think if I got other questions.
Well, we can open it to questions if you're
great.
willing. Oh. Questions, reactions, stories of your own experience with international students.
This is kind of a personal question.
That's okay.
Dave Ferguson. I just couldn't imagine growing up on a farm, going overseas to study, and you brought up the fact that your experience in Denmark wasn't very good, and I'm just so curious about that.
That sounded really negative, didn't it? I'm
Yes.
sorry. When I say it wasn't good, it was really good, but it was really hard. Is that better? A better way to say it?
Certainly, I would think it would be impossible.
It was, my world was rocked in ways that I did not predict. And I feel like I came from a fairly homogeneous place and was surrounded by people who thought in very similar ways. And when I went to Copenhagen, even though I was with lots of students from the US, from all over the country, I felt like it was the first time I was really thinking deeply about how I viewed the world and what my role in it was, how much culture impacted political choices and social choices. And so it really flipped my, I don't know if you've seen, with our international students, we use the image of a world map that's flipped upside down. It's actually, I'm sorry I can't say the citation of where the map comes from, but it's called Who Said North Was Up? And we use that with students a lot because I actually feel like it's important to celebrate the idea of seeing something that is entirely accurate flipped on its upside down, right? So when you see the image of the map of the world and it's flipped upside down, it is still entirely possible to find every place that you know, to connect meaning with everything that you're looking at, but your world is a little bit, it takes you time, right, to figure it out. So I actually in my office have the flipped upside down map, and when I'm working with students who are feeling lost and culturally lost, that when you actually say, let's find where home is on the map, it takes them a minute to find it because the map's upside down, but they will find it and they know exactly where it is. And I think that's how I felt in Denmark.
Thank you. I felt that way when I went from Montezuma to Iowa State. So.
Actually, I think that's lovely, though. I think that is a really good comparison. It's a totally valid comparison. So I feel like growing up in small town Iowa, diversity was about who lived in the town, who lived in town, who lived in the country, or who was Catholic and who was Protestant, who had the means to travel, who didn't. So we still wrangled with issues of diversity and identity in a different context, in a different microcosm, right? But if you take that same feeling and then take it into a larger context, it's pretty interesting.
Thank you.
You said you've been, John Knorr, you said you've been to a lot of countries. Why? Your husband does the recruiting. And you're stuck in an office most of the time. What brings you to all those other countries?
Well, early in my career, I traveled a lot because I was trying to set the stage for my career. So I traveled on a State Department grant to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia as part of a grant exploratory learning about higher education in those places. I did the internship in Malaysia, traveled, I'm trying to remember other specific examples, but a lot of my travels early on were based on my interest in growing my career. And I think as that has evolved, it's kind of shifted into going to attending my students' weddings, taking my children to experience culture, benefiting from my husband's frequent flyer miles. Though I still do get to travel internationally a little bit for my work, for a conference. As recently, well, it's been a while now, but I did a presentation at a conference in Portugal. I was in Greece this last fall for involved with a conference. So some of it's professional development. That's a great question, though. John gets to travel more for work stuff.
Stan Greenwald. You mentioned that other similar schools will probably give up having international students. And apparently our program here has grown immensely during the last 20 years. What do you predict where we're going at Grinnell?
Yeah, and I just realized that this is going to be on the internet, that I just said that schools might not be able to sustain it. But I actually wonder if schools will be able to sustain the infrastructure because it's pretty intense. I actually feel like Grinnell, I don't ever expect, well, you know, who can predict the future entirely, but I think Grinnell is very committed to this. And I feel really affirmed and lucky to be in an institution that is. So I feel like the truth is you're going to need to be either really committed or not committed. There's no halfway. Just simple things like in the new regs, there's increased fees for the institution to even have the licensure to do it. There's discussion, which I actually would like to see a little bit higher requirements for certifications of DSOs. You know, a lot of people who started in this work did it because we loved culture and did it because we were interested in cultural sojourn in general. That's why I started in the field. Now you see people entering the field who are interested in the legal issues. And so it's really shifted the dynamic. But I hope that we'll always be able to maintain that balance between the regular. I'm not really answering your question very well.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, balancing those two dynamics, right? But man, if you enroll international students and you don't have a solid legal infrastructure for this, you could get yourself in trouble, you could get your institution in trouble, and you could get the students in trouble, and it's hard to know which one to prioritize, right?
Do you feel that you'll continue at about 20%, or will you be 30%?
Oh, at Grinnell? That decision's made at a far higher pay grade than mine. For me, where I sit in the infrastructure, 20% feels really good for one main reason. It means that international students are a part of the fabric of our campus culture. It means they are not a little bit on the side or a little bit out of the norm or a little unusual. So I would hope, it would be my hope as an institution that no student who enrolls at Grinnell does not leave this place not having a good friend from somewhere else in the world. And that no international student will leave this place not having made a good friendship and a deep connection with an American student, with a US student. And so what 20% does is it means that it's very unlikely that you would live on a floor that is only students from the United States. It's you would never be in a first year tutorial that didn't involve 3 or 4 international students. It just makes it part of the fabric of it allows us to do this infrastructure, right? As opposed to an Office of International Student Affairs with a larger number of international students becomes the end-all, the be-all, the go-all. We focus specifically on individual students. Here, we're not doing that. Everyone is thinking about international students. The right one right here.
Joan Baker.
Yeah.
there must be zillions of alumni all over the world. Do you make an effort to get students coming in touch with Grinnell alums?
Yeah, John does more of that than I do, I guess. For example, he just did yield events in India, and Tina Elfenbein just did a yield event in Japan, and that included inviting students who had just been admitted to join us in the fall, and inviting alum who were in the area to come and meet them and connect with them. We could probably do way more of that than we do if we had more infrastructure and staffing, but we do that. I think some of that is because it's done very informally. It's because we have relationships and we're still connected on Facebook, so I know who's where or whatever. But development and alumni relations are also increasingly involved and invested in this conversation. Yep.
I'm Jean Libby. I'm curious about the comfort level for students when they arrive in the area of food and language. And I've heard, and maybe this is more from students in China, from China, that the food doesn't match at all what they're accustomed to. And I just think the language, trying to write a paper in English when that's not been maybe your major language would be extremely difficult. How much problem do you see with issues like that?
I think we have always and will always see issues like that when you're changing systems, when you're changing language. I'd say that is another example where we have active partners throughout campus. So we, as Janet stands here and we think about the writing lab, you know, right now there's lots of discussions on campus about the future of the writing lab and with writing and reading and speaking and how those influence each other. I can imagine a stronger infrastructure for non-native speakers in that context is very much on the horizon. And I think those kinds of conversations are really important to have. Are we doing it well? We're doing it well? Could we get better? Absolutely. Our faculty are amazing at helping students navigate those issues. It's not just whether they're writing a paper in English for the first time, it's that our paper structures are different. They have different concepts around academic citations and how to use sources. In many cultures, the concept of an original source is very different than it is for us. So we see academic honesty issues that are really not because a student is making a good choice or a bad choice, but because their educational infrastructure guided them in different ways to view these systems, right? So those are important things. I bet you have all sorts of things to add to that. Food is interesting. I just was actually part of a Snapchat event at a colleague of mine at another ACM-GLCA school wrote to all of us. We talk to each other all the time. We've got kind of a listserv of advisors at these small schools. And he wanted to all of us to go to our dining services office and Snapchat a picture of the rice cooker in the dining hall because he was trying on his campus to advocate for their dining services to add a rice cooker to their dining hall. So, all of us who had them ran around and took pictures. So I think absolutely impacts diet. And
Nancy Brown. Which countries give the potential student the greatest angst in terms of getting that non-immigrant visa? In other words, requiring or having verification that they will return to their home country.
There's nothing published about that. But there's lots of stories. And we do know that our students from certain countries only get the one-year visa. That's pretty standard. But I think it's definitely Muslim countries and our men from Muslim countries predominantly Muslim countries who typically will face more scrutiny, greater scrutiny in that regard. Or students who are coming, maybe the political changes so fast. It would also be true, like if a student's in an interview and they talk about they're bringing their mother and their brother, like they could say something really fast that a consular officer is going to hear as this person's intending to immigrate, right? So that is a delicate balance too. We're not telling, we want our students to be honest about their intentions, right? But we also want them to be very well aware that the non-immigrant intent is a really key piece of that. I'm not sure I can give a real good answer of the specifics on that.
I'm a class agent of 54, and one of my classmates in Germany made the comment that everybody else seems to have groups where somebody from the United States comes and meets, but he said, in all the years he's been there, it's only been twice. And I thought, that's a lot. Why? What has? Do we try to reach out to other students that are from other countries? I know, when you get...
I don't quite follow your question. Try again.
Well, there are a lot of times when somebody will come over and they'll have a group meeting of students, and he has not been ever contacted except twice for any one of these groups of Grinnell College students overseas in Germany, and he was wondering why.
So are you asking if we are actively recruiting in Germany?
No, if you're actively meeting with the students that have been here.
Yeah. Well, we don't actively travel to lots of places in the world, and in terms of recruiting, Germany would be a place that we would not typically actively. We do get students from Germany every once in a while, but in the EU, higher education is part of the Bologna Accords. It's free. Most of the students from Europe who come to the United States would be on exchange programs as opposed to degree-seeking students.
I think the reference sheet, I think what she is asking is, as work is being done in getting students from various countries, are former Grinnell students, U.S. students, in that country used in that process of recruiting, of informing, as we invite graduates to meet with potential students in this country? Is the same thing done in foreign countries where we have former American students who are living there, working there, and then lived out their adult life?
Yeah. I would say there would not be a lot of that that's done, no. There would be times when the college might have other activities that take place in those places where alumni would be involved. But we certainly don't do events in every country around the globe. There's no doubt that we don't do that.
Marjorie Graves, we hear that there's such a shortage of STEM graduates, highly trained professionals.
Can you speak up a little bit?
I'm
sorry.
This is on.
Right in your...
Yeah, we hear that there's such a large number of jobs requiring advanced training, and especially in the STEM field, and we train all these foreign students. So my question is there any opportunity at all for them to remain in this country and take some of those jobs?
That's a great question, and it's actually, I'd say that is probably one of the reasons why the STEM OPT extension exists at all, is to encourage folks who are in those STEM fields who have jobs that qualify to be able to work there. The students who are in OPT and STEM OPT on their work permits are often sponsored by their employers to try to seek a new employment visa called an H-1B. There's other options, but H-1B is the most common. What happens with the STEM extension is that that gives them actually multiple years that they can try for that pool. So it's pretty complicated. I don't need to get in all the details, but like if a student is using OPT and they're applying for the H-1B to stay another year, they only have one chance to do that because that's an annual process and there's limits on it. But if they do STEM and OPT, then they get to try to be a part of that pool multiple times. So it increases the likelihood that they would get sponsored. But that's an example where immigration policy in the current administration perspectives on the H-1B become really challenging for liberal arts majors because you can only get sponsored for the H-1B if you have a specialty occupation. That means you're working in a job that requires the specific major that you hold. And the definition has gotten more and more narrow of what a specialty occupation is. So where we with a liberal arts environment might say, for example, that anthropology example, that an anthropologist is absolutely qualified for marketing work. That connection would work for the practical training, but it would not work for STEM OPT, and it would never work for an H-1B, well, very rarely work for an H-1B. So the concept of moving down that thread to be able to right now be sponsored to an employment visa status in the U.S. is very connected to having a major in a specific field that's required for the specific job. STEM fields is the most likely.
We have time for one more question.
I take it Africa is included in the 1/4 rarebirds because there's
very small.
3/4 is Asia. Are we not recruiting in Africa, or what's the reason for that?
Well, we recruit in Africa. It's a harder market to be able to support financially. I should mention too that would be true nationwide. Our students from Africa are amazing. We typically have students from Ghana, Zimbabwe, sometimes Tanzania. We have a couple students from Kenya right now, Ethiopia. I think there's a few admitted students this year from Nigeria. But funding is always a challenge, is often a challenge. I don't have a very good answer. We do travel there, but not aggressively.
Karen, thank you so much. We have learned a great deal.